There are battles that never make the evening news. Battles fought not with fists or fire, but with chalk and pencils, with questions asked and voices silenced, with the weight of history pressing down on the walls of a classroom. This is one of those stories. A story of resilience, of struggle, of a woman who dared to stand where she was not welcomed, and of the children who followed her into light. Before we begin, take a moment to join us in this journey. Subscribe to Blackness Hour, where the untold stories of Black resilience, brilliance, and triumph find their voice. Share this with others, so the light carried here doesn't dim in silence. Now, let us step inside Westbridge Academy, where a young woman named Dr. Maya Johnson would face her greatest test, not of books, but of belonging. The morning sun spread itself across the city like a painter reluctant to use too much color, casting gray-gold streaks over buildings that bore stories of both triumph and survival. Inside her modest apartment, Dr. Maya Johnson sat quietly, the sound of her own breath the only companion in the room. Today was not just another day. It was the beginning of a trial, one that would test not only her knowledge but her strength, her dignity, and her very right to exist in spaces designed to shut her out. Her doctorate degree hung framed on the wall across from her bed, a crisp certificate stamped with authority, its glossy surface gleaming faintly in the morning light. But for Maya, that frame was not a trophy. It was armor. Proof, against a world that doubted her, that she had earned her place. Proof that the whispers she had endured, the voices that told her she was too ambitious, too loud, or lucky to get this far, had been wrong. She smoothed the navy blazer folded neatly on the dresser. The fabric was firm beneath her fingertips, freshly pressed, smelling faintly of starch. She slipped it on slowly, deliberately, fastening each button as though sealing away the uncertainty clawing at her chest. Her reflection stared back at her from the mirror. She traced the lines of her face, strong cheekbones, eyes burning with determination. Her braids, pulled back with precision, carried not just her style but the weight of heritage. She saw her grandmother there, a woman who had walked through segregated doors and refused to bow. She saw her mother, who had worked 2 jobs to put food on the table, her hands cracked and tired but never too weary to tell her daughter, "Baby, you were made for more." Maya whispered the words now, as if summoning courage from the ancestors who walked beside her. You were made for more. Her childhood rose before her like a ghost. Baltimore's East Side, where red lines carved neighborhoods into cages. Schools with chipped paint, where the heater worked only half the year, where textbooks had missing pages and desks carried graffiti carved by generations of children who had given up believing their futures mattered. Yet Maya never gave up. Her mother had pressed a plastic library card into her small hands when she was just 5. "This," she'd said, "is your weapon." And Maya wielded it with the fierceness of someone who knew that words could cut chains. She had wandered those library aisles as if they were cathedrals, devouring Baldwin, Morrison, Hughes, Douglas. Each book was a lifeline. Each page, a whispered promise that her world could be bigger than the blocks around her. But teachers rarely saw her fire for what it was. "You're so articulate," they said, as if it were a surprise. "You're different," they told her, as if excellence belonged only to others. They nudged her toward realistic goals, urging her away from the dreams that seemed too large for someone like her. Every compliment came with an undercurrent of disbelief, every smile with a shadow of condescension. She had carried their doubt like bricks in her pockets. But instead of sinking, she used them to build a foundation. Long nights, endless study, a relentless pursuit of knowledge. By 28, she stood in cap and gown, a doctorate in education etched into her name. Her dissertation dissected the silent machinery of standardized testing, how it punished the voices of the marginalized, how it built invisible walls for children who had been taught the wrong language for the right answers. Professors praised her as brilliant. Journals published her research. For a moment, Maya felt the system nod in acknowledgement. But recognition is not protection. The letter had come on crisp stationery, embossed with the emblem of Westbridge Academy. A prestigious institution, whispered about in academic circles with reverence. Its gates were iron, its lawns sprawling and surgically trimmed. The kind of school that produced senators' children, CEOs, future leaders. The kind of school where tradition mattered more than innovation, where wealth coated the walls like a second layer of paint. And now, Maya Johnson had been chosen to teach there. The offer was generous, a salary that could ease her mother's burdens, benefits that spoke of security, and prestige that could open further doors. But Maya knew this was not simply an opportunity. It was an assignment from history itself, a chance to stand where few like her had stood and refused to be invisible. The morning she arrived at Westbridge, she walked with her head high, heels striking stone with steady rhythm. The gates loomed tall, their black iron bars curling into ornate patterns. Beyond them, the campus unfurled like a painting, red brick buildings cloaked in ivy, white columns gleaming, students spilling from gleaming cars, their uniforms immaculate. The air smelled faintly of trimmed grass and old money. Parents clustered at the drop-off circle, their voices carrying the clipped tones of privilege. Their eyes slid over her, some curious, others dismissive, a few openly skeptical. She felt the weight of their gaze press against her skin. Inside the office, the secretary greeted her with a smile too polished to be sincere. "Dr. Johnson," she said, stumbling ever so slightly on the title, as though the word doctor didn't quite belong to the young black woman standing before her. "Thank you," Maya replied, letting the title ring in the air like a bell. The staff lounge was no warmer. Conversations dipped into silence when she entered, then resumed with forced cheer. Compliments arrived wrapped in condescension. "So impressive at your age. Quite an achievement, considering." Their eyes scanned her as though she were an anomaly, something out of place among the polished oak furniture and framed degrees lining the walls. By afternoon, she was summoned to the headmaster's office. Mr. Whitfield was a man carved from tradition, silver hair parted neatly, suit tailored to perfection. The office smelled of leather and polish, lined with shelves of books whose spines gleamed untouched. Portraits of past headmasters stared down from the walls, their pale faces stern and unyielding. "Dr. Johnson," Whitfield began, his voice smooth, deliberate. "We are delighted to welcome you." Maya inclined her head. "I'm grateful for the opportunity." He leaned back, fingers steepled. "I've reviewed your record. Impressive credentials, no doubt. But your methods—" His eyes flicked briefly to her file. "Group projects, debates, student-led inquiry. Admirable in theory. But here, our parents expect rigor, structure, excellence. This is not the place for experimentation." Maya's jaw tightened. Rigor and innovation are not opposites. Students learn best when they're engaged, when they see learning as more than memorization. Whitfield's expression gave nothing away. After a pause, he said, "All eyes will be on you, Dr. Johnson. Remember that." The words followed her out of the office like shadows. Her classroom waited at the end of a long corridor, sunlight spilling through tall windows, dust motes drifting lazily in the air. Rows of desks stood like soldiers awaiting orders. Maps and charts lined the walls, reminders of lessons past. She placed her hand on the teacher's desk, the wood cool beneath her palm. This was her space now. Her battlefield. When the students arrived, their chatter filled the room with sharp energy. They wore their uniforms like armor, polished shoes, crisp shirts, ties knotted neatly. Their laughter was easy, confident, untouched by struggle. "Good morning," Maya greeted, her voice steady. A boy in the front row smirked and mimicked her tone. The class erupted in giggles. Chloe, a girl with hair perfectly braided and an air of practiced disdain, rolled her eyes theatrically. Another leaned toward his neighbor and whispered, loud enough for her to hear, "She's only here 'cause of diversity." The words cut deep, but Maya's face betrayed nothing. She let silence settle, her gaze sweeping the room until the giggles faded. "In this classroom," she said evenly, "every one of you has the potential for greatness. But greatness demands respect, discipline, and courage. If you rise to that challenge, you'll succeed, not just here, but everywhere." The room stilled. Some fidgeted, some looked away, but the laughter was gone. The battle lines had been drawn. That evening, Maya returned to her apartment and sank into her chair. Her bag lay at her feet, her lesson plans spilling from it. She thought of Ethan's mocking tone, Chloe's eye roll, the whispered word, diversity. She thought of Whitfield's warning. Her mother's voice rose in memory. Baby, the classroom is where they'll try to tell you what you can't be. Show them what you already are. Maya picked up her pen. If this was war, she would not fight unarmed. She adjusted her lesson plans, crafting strategies like blueprints for survival. She would meet their doubt with fire. The city outside her window pulsed with life, sirens in the distance, laughter spilling from stoops, buses rumbling past. The world had never been easy. But Maya had never asked for easy. She asked only for the chance to fight. The next morning, the air outside Westbridge Academy was crisp, the kind of autumn chill that carried both promise and unease. Maya stepped through the iron gates once more, her heels echoing against the cobblestones. She told herself the same mantra she had whispered since childhood: you belong. You belong. The corridors bustled with energy. Students clustered around lockers, voices rising in chatter, their laughter sharp and carefree. Teachers exchanged pleasantries, their words dropping into silence as Maya passed. The polished floors reflected her image back at her, a solitary figure moving against the current of tradition. She entered her classroom early, arranging papers on her desk with methodical precision. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, highlighting specks of chalk dust floating in the air. Today, she would test her philosophy. Today, she would refuse to simply lecture from behind the desk. Instead, she would call her students into the work of thinking for themselves. When the bell rang, bodies shuffled into seats, uniforms crisp, faces smug with expectation. Ethan slouched in his chair, tapping his pen against the desk in a rhythm that carried disdain. Chloe leaned back, eyes half-lidded, her expression sharpened into a smirk. The air brimmed with challenge. Maya began by distributing copies of a short story, a piece about a young boy forced to make difficult choices in a world stacked against him. No names of authors were printed, no cultural clues revealed. Read carefully, she instructed. And then we'll discuss what it means. For 10 minutes, silence. Pages rustled, pens tapped, whispers flickered. Maya's gaze swept the room, noting who lingered on sentences, who skimmed quickly, who frowned in thought. When they finished, she asked, "What do you think the story is really about?" Blank stares met her. A few shrugged. Ethan muttered, "It's just about some kid messing up his life. Should have just followed the rules." Laughter erupted, rippling across the room. Maya's pulse quickened, but her voice remained calm. "Do you think it's that simple?" "It is," Ethan insisted, his grin daring her to push back. Maya leaned forward slightly, her eyes steady. What if the rules themselves were unfair? What if the system he lived in didn't allow him the same chances as others? A hush followed. The students glanced at one another, uncertain. Finally, from the back row, a girl raised her hand tentatively. "I think," she began, her voice soft, "it's about choices. Like, how every decision changes what comes next. And how sometimes the choices you get aren't really choices at all." Maya smiled gently. "Yes. Exactly. That's the heart of it. That's the kind of thinking that matters." The class shifted uneasily. For the first time, the room carried not mockery, but thought. The spark was faint, but it was there. Still, resistance lingered. Chloe rolled her eyes and whispered, "This isn't English class, it's therapy." Snickers followed. Maya ignored the jab, continuing with her questions, guiding the students to wrestle with meaning, to challenge each other. The discussion staggered forward, halting but alive. After class, she collected the stories left scattered on desks. She felt a flicker of hope. But that hope was quickly challenged when she opened her email later that night. Messages from parents filled her inbox. One wrote, "We expect structure and results, not abstract discussions. Group chatter is not worth the tuition we pay." Another warned, This is not a public school. We did not enroll our children to become experiments. Each sentence landed like a blow, bruising her spirit. She closed her laptop, exhaling sharply into the silence of her apartment. The words echoed her deepest fear, that she did not belong here, that she was an outsider trespassing in a world that had no room for her. But then, her gaze fell on the photograph propped on her desk. Her graduation day. She in cap and gown, her mother's arms around her, her grandmother's eyes glistening with pride. Maya traced the edges of the frame with trembling fingers. She whispered into the quiet, "I didn't come this far to bend." The next morning, she adjusted. She studied her students closely, weaving their interests into her lessons. When Ethan boasted about basketball, she turned it into a math problem on shooting percentages. When Chloe scoffed at essays, Maya challenged her to write one about fashion as influence and power. At first, the students resisted, but curiosity flickered. Some leaned forward, intrigued despite themselves. Bit by bit, the wall cracked. One afternoon, as the sun slanted across the room, Ethan begrudgingly raised his hand. "So, if the system's unfair, like you said yesterday, does that mean rules don't matter?" Maya paused, savoring the question. "No. Rules matter. But understanding who makes them, and why, matters more." The class fell into thoughtful silence. Ethan shifted in his seat, uncomfortable with his own engagement. Still, outside her classroom, Maya felt the cold. Staff meetings remained stiff. Colleagues praised each other, while offering her only silence or vague nods. Mr. Carlton continued to give condescending advice about discipline. Headmaster Whitfield's eyes lingered on her during meetings, sharp, appraising, waiting for cracks to show. One evening after a particularly tense staff session, Maya stepped outside into the school courtyard. The night air was cool, stars barely visible above the city's glow. She sat on a stone bench, shoulders heavy with fatigue. For a moment, she let herself feel the loneliness press in, thick and suffocating. Then she pulled out her phone, scrolling aimlessly until something familiar caught her eye, a video thumbnail from Blackness Hour, the very channel she had leaned on during her doctoral years. She tapped it, and a calm voice filled her ears, narrating the story of another black teacher who had defied impossible odds. She closed her eyes, letting the words wash over her. She remembered the nights she had stayed up writing her dissertation, headphones in, clinging to stories like this for strength. She smiled faintly. And she thought perhaps someone else out there was listening now, searching for strength the same way. Someone sitting in silence, earphones in, needing to know they were not alone. And to you listening now, if Maya's fight speaks to your spirit, pause for a moment and subscribe to Blackness Hour. Stories like hers matter. Voices like hers cannot fade. Together, we build the chorus that cannot be silenced. The reminder steadied her. She looked up at the faint stars and whispered a thank you to those who had carried her this far. The next day, she entered her classroom with renewed resolve. Her voice was firmer, her questions sharper. She demanded evidence, challenged weak arguments, forced her students to dig deeper. At first, they resisted. But slowly, undeniably, engagement grew. A boy leaned forward eagerly. A girl debated with newfound fire. Even Ethan, sarcasm still dripping from his tone, found himself caught in the current of real discussion. By dismissal, the classroom felt different. Tension lingered, yes, but beneath it pulsed something else, the faint thrum of respect, though none would admit it aloud. When the students filed out, Maya lingered alone. The room smelled faintly of chalk and dust, sunlight still streaming through tall panes. She leaned against her desk, exhaling long and deep. She had not won the war. Not yet. But she had gained ground. She gathered her papers, straightened the rows of chairs, and turned off the lights. As she walked down the quiet corridor, her heels striking steady against the polished floor, she carried not just her own weight, but the invisible strength of those who had walked before her. Tomorrow would bring new battles. She knew the sabotage would not end. She knew the parents' whispers, the colleagues' stares, the headmaster's doubt would linger. But tonight, as she left Westbridge Academy behind her, she carried something more powerful than fear. She carried proof that even here, in the heart of resistance, she could plant seeds. Seeds that might grow into something unstoppable. And that, she thought, was enough to keep walking. The second week at Westbridge dawned with the same crisp air, but for Maya, the freshness of her first day had dulled into something heavier. She could feel the atmosphere of scrutiny pressing in, not just from her students but from the very walls of the school. The institution seemed alive, its traditions whispering through the corridors, reminding her that she was a guest in a house built without her in mind. Still, she woke early, her body trained by years of discipline, her heart wrapped in a cloak of resilience. She tied her braids with care, pressed her blazer until it was flawless, and pinned the school's insignia to her lapel with the steadiness of a soldier donning armor. The city streets outside her apartment were still damp with dew as she boarded the bus. She could have driven, but she preferred this. The hum of the bus, the sway of strangers pressed together, the faint smell of coffee and morning cologne, these things kept her grounded. They reminded her that while Westbridge loomed like an ivory tower, she came from a different world, one that pulsed with grit, community, and unvarnished truth. When she stepped off at the corner near the academy, the campus spread out before her like a grand stage. Red brick walls rose high, framed by manicured lawns that seemed too green, too perfect. The fountain in the courtyard gurgled with studied serenity, its marble edges polished like a jewel. Students arrived in a stream of polished cars, their parents dropping them off with quick waves, their shoes shining brighter than the morning sun. Maya walked through the gates with her bag slung over one shoulder, papers tucked neatly inside. A group of parents near the entrance glanced her way. One mother, pearls strung carefully around her neck, whispered something behind a manicured hand. The others smirked, their eyes darting toward Maya before returning to their conversation. She didn't need to hear the words to know their content. She'd read that look before. It said, "What is she doing here?" Inside the teacher's lounge, the atmosphere was no kinder. Conversations dipped when she entered, then resumed with a forced casualness that made the silence in between all the louder. A colleague named Mrs. Barrett, a woman whose family had taught at Westbridge for generations, smiled thinly at Maya as she sipped her tea. "Adjusting well, Dr. Johnson?" she asked, her tone laced with the faintest patronage. Maya nodded politely. "Thank you, yes. It's been an enlightening start." Barrett's eyes twinkled, though not with kindness. "Westbridge has a way of sorting things out. The school thrives on discipline, not experiments. Parents here expect nothing less." Maya held her gaze, refusing to look away. "Innovation and discipline are not enemies, Mrs. Barrett. Both can coexist, if the intention is true learning." The older woman tilted her head, as if indulging a child's idealism, before turning back to her tea. That exchange lingered with Maya as she made her way to class. It was not just resistance from students now, it was the institution itself. A fortress of tradition stood against her, its defenders cloaked not in open hostility but in polite skepticism, which cut all the deeper for its civility. Her classroom greeted her with the comfort of familiarity, though even here the battle was ongoing. Her students had learned to test her boundaries with practiced ease. They challenged instructions, whispered mockeries, and occasionally mocked her accent when her Baltimore cadence slipped through. Each insult was a blade, sharp not because it was new but because it echoed centuries of prejudice. Still, Maya did not yield. She had resolved to meet every barb with steel wrapped in calm. That day, she introduced a new method, collaborative debates. She divided the students into groups and gave them topics that touched on real-world issues. She knew it was risky. She could already sense the disapproval from administrators who valued rote memorization over messy, living discourse. But she pressed on. "Your task," she explained, "is not simply to argue your side, but to understand the other. To step into shoes you may never wear and defend a perspective that challenges you." The students groaned. Chloe muttered under her breath, "This is a waste of time." Ethan leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, smirk tugging at his lips. But Maya pressed forward. She assigned teams, set the topics, and stepped back as the room filled with hesitant chatter. At first, it was chaos, voices overlapping, complaints spilling out. But gradually, patterns formed. Some students leaned in, curiosity piqued despite themselves. Others scribbled notes, reluctantly, their disdain thinning into concentration. When the debates began, the first attempts were clumsy. Ethan scoffed his way through his group's opening argument, while Chloe rolled her eyes at every counterpoint. Yet, as Maya pushed them to dig deeper, sparks of thought flickered. By the end of the session, the classroom buzzed with a rare energy. One boy, previously silent, raised his voice in defense of an argument with surprising passion. Another, skeptical at first, countered with evidence drawn from his own readings. For a brief moment, the class was alive in a way that transcended tradition. Still, Maya knew better than to celebrate too soon. At dismissal, she overheard Chloe whisper to another student, "My mom's going to complain about this. She says we should be learning facts, not feelings." And she was right. That evening, Maya's inbox filled once more with sharp words from parents. One message read, "Our children are not here to be social experiments. We pay for the best education, not ideological experiments." Another accused her of pushing an agenda. Maya closed her laptop, her chest tight. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. The battle was shifting, growing larger. It was no longer confined to the classroom walls. It was spilling into the living rooms of her students' families, where prejudice was nurtured and passed down like inheritance. She thought of calling her mother, hearing her steady voice, but decided against it. Her mother had carried enough of the world's burdens. Maya could not add to them tonight. Instead, she reached for the well-worn journal she kept by her bedside. She opened to a blank page and began to write, her pen scratching furiously against the paper. She wrote about the looks in the lounge, the whispers at the gate, the dismissive emails. She wrote about her students' resistance, their subtle cruelties, their reluctant sparks of curiosity. She wrote, too, of her own fear of failure, fear of proving the doubters right. But then she wrote of her grandmother, who had scrubbed floors in houses where she was never seen as equal, who had endured slurs and silence, yet taught her children to dream bigger than their circumstances. She wrote of her mother, who had sacrificed so much so Maya could walk into rooms like this with her head high. By the time she set the pen down, her shoulders felt lighter. The journal had become a vessel for her grief, her anger, her hope. The next morning, she walked back into Westbridge determined to continue. When she entered her classroom, the students were waiting, their chatter sharp and pointed. She had heard the murmurs in the hall. Parents had indeed complained, and the children now carried those complaints in their tones and smirks. Chloe raised her hand before class even began. "My mom says you're wasting our time with debates. She says we need to focus on the exam if we want to get into good schools." Maya nodded, her expression calm. "Your mother isn't wrong. Exams are important. But let me ask you this. Do you think memorizing facts alone will prepare you for the world outside these walls?" The room was silent. "You'll face challenges that won't have multiple choice answers. You'll be asked to solve problems that demand empathy, creativity, courage. That's what we practice here. That's what education is meant to be." Some students shifted uneasily. Others crossed their arms, unconvinced. But a few leaned forward, curious despite themselves. Maya pressed on. She guided them through the lesson, weaving in both rigor and relevance, determined to show them that learning was not a transaction but a transformation. Still, at the end of the day, she could not ignore the heaviness in her chest. She knew she was climbing uphill against more than just reluctant students. She was battling the expectations of an entire system that had been built to keep people like her out. But as she gathered her papers, she whispered once more the words that had carried her this far: "You belong. You belong." And she resolved, no matter how high the walls, no matter how sharp the whispers, to keep climbing. The days rolled forward, each one a test of resolve. Maya could feel the rhythm of the school now, the way Westbridge seemed to hum with its own cadence. Polished shoes striking marble floors, the chiming of bells, the murmurs of privilege that floated in the halls like perfume. Every sound was a reminder that she was a guest here, expected to either adapt or fail. She noticed how her students watched her, not just for lessons but for cracks in her confidence. They mirrored the suspicion of their parents, whose wealth had trained them to see authority only in familiar faces. For them, Maya was an experiment, tolerated for now, but only until she stumbled. And stumble they expected her to do. One morning, she entered class to find her chalkboard scrawled with crude messages. The words were veiled enough to avoid direct punishment, but pointed enough to sting. Affirmative action teacher, diversity higher, not good enough. The students sat in their seats, eyes fixed on her, waiting. Maya's chest tightened, but she steadied her breath. She picked up the eraser, swept the words away in silence, and began her lesson as if nothing had happened. Yet inside, her spirit trembled. She knew they were testing her patience, probing to see if she would lash out, if she would confirm their parents' whispered doubts. But she refused to give them that satisfaction. Instead, she leaned into her teaching, pouring her energy into lessons designed not just to inform but to transform. That week, she introduced project-based learning. The assignment: research the history of education inequities in America and present findings in creative form. She expected resistance, and she got it. Groans filled the room. Chloe muttered about her mother calling the headmaster, and Ethan joked loudly about learning how to fail. Still, she pressed on. Over the days, something unexpected happened. A few students, almost reluctantly, began to dig deeper. One boy stumbled upon the story of the Little Rock Nine and was shaken by their bravery. A girl discovered how redlining had shaped schools in her own city. Their eyes, once glazed with disdain, flickered with the faint light of realization. Of course, not all followed. Ethan mocked the project openly, and Chloe rolled her eyes through presentations. But for every sneer, there was a spark. For every laugh, a pause of thought. Maya clung to those sparks. Yet the resistance outside her classroom grew louder. Parents complained to Headmaster Whitfield, who summoned her for a private meeting. His office, lined with dark wood and leather-bound books, smelled faintly of cigars and old authority. "Dr. Johnson," he began, his voice smooth but cold, "there have been concerns. Parents feel your methods deviate from the rigor expected at Westbridge. They say you are focusing too much on social matters, not enough on academic outcomes." Maya sat straight, her hands folded in her lap. "With respect, sir, true academic success cannot be separated from social context. Our students live in a world shaped by these realities. Pretending otherwise diminishes their education." Whitfield's gaze sharpened. "Your passion is evident. But Westbridge thrives on reputation. We cannot risk that on experiments. I suggest you keep to the curriculum, strictly." Maya's jaw tightened. She nodded politely, but inside, her resolve burned. She knew what he was asking: to silence herself, to dilute her vision, to become a ghost of the educator she had fought to be. That night she sat in her apartment, staring at the city lights. Doubt pressed heavily on her chest. Was she wrong to push? Was she sabotaging her own career? Her phone buzzed, a message from her mother. "Proud of you, baby. Remember, the higher the wall, the more they fear what's on the other side." Maya closed her eyes, letting the words sink into her bones. She remembered her grandmother's hands, cracked from years of labor, holding hers with unshakable strength. She remembered the countless hours spent studying, the nights she wanted to quit but didn't. She whispered to herself, "I will not fold." The next day, she walked back into her classroom with new determination. She adjusted her blazer, smoothed the chalk dust from her sleeves, and met her students' eyes with unwavering calm. She began the lesson with a simple statement: "Knowledge is power. And power can be used to build or to break. Which do you choose?" The room grew quiet. Even Ethan, though smirking, leaned slightly forward. As discussions unfolded, Maya pushed them harder. She challenged weak arguments, demanded evidence, encouraged empathy. The debates were fierce, but beneath the resistance she could sense growth. At one point, Chloe blurted, Why should we care about people who don't work as hard as us? Her tone dripped with inherited arrogance. Maya paused, letting the silence stretch. Then she asked, "Have you ever thought about what it means to work hard when the world is tilted against you? When every door you reach is locked before you touch it?" The question lingered, heavy in the air. Some students shifted uncomfortably. A few lowered their eyes. Chloe had no quick retort. For Maya, it was a small victory. But victories here were always fragile. That afternoon, she overheard two teachers in the lounge whispering about her. "She won't last the semester," one muttered. "Parents will see to that." The words cut deep, but Maya held her head high. She knew her battle was not just for survival. It was for recognition, for proving that brilliance does not come with a color, that resilience is not weakness, and that truth cannot be buried under tradition. Later that week, the projects were presented. Some were shallow, thrown together at the last minute. But others shone with surprising depth. One group staged a mock trial of segregation, arguing passionately about justice and equality. Another created a visual timeline, weaving their own family's histories into broader narratives. Maya watched, pride swelling in her chest. These students, so resistant at first, were beginning to see the world differently. Even if they wouldn't admit it, they were learning. After the final presentation, as the students filed out, one girl lingered by the door. She hesitated, then said softly, "I never knew schools used to be segregated like that. It's kind of messed up." Maya smiled gently. "Yes. And it's important we don't forget. History isn't just the past, it's the soil we stand on today." The girl nodded before slipping out, her eyes thoughtful. It was enough. Enough to keep Maya fighting. That night, as she graded papers, she paused and looked at her phone. She thought of the unseen audience out there, people listening to stories like hers, needing courage. She whispered as though speaking to them directly. "If you're hearing this, don't forget, voices like ours need to be heard. Take a moment, subscribe, share. Because silence has never changed the world." Her words hung in the air, both a plea and a promise. By the end of the week, though exhaustion weighed heavy on her shoulders, Maya felt steadier. She was battered but not broken, doubted but not defeated. The walls of Westbridge still loomed tall. The whispers of parents still echoed. The glares of colleagues still pierced. But within her classroom, something was shifting. Something was growing. And Maya, standing alone after dismissal, looking at the empty desks and the fading sunlight on the chalkboard, knew one truth with certainty. The battle was only beginning. The autumn air grew sharper as October settled in, and with it came a shift in the undercurrent of Westbridge Academy. The leaves on the grand oak trees blazed in hues of gold and crimson, but for Maya, the beauty outside her classroom windows contrasted painfully with the tension inside. The first month had stripped away much of her early optimism. Now, she understood the school not as a sanctuary of learning but as a battlefield where every lesson was a skirmish, every smile a mask, every silence a weapon. The whispers about her had grown louder. Students repeated fragments of conversations overheard at dinner tables, fathers dismissing her as unqualified, mothers sneering about her background, relatives questioning the school's standards for hiring her. The children did not always grasp the cruelty of their words, but they carried them like daggers sharpened by adult tongues. Maya had grown accustomed to those daggers. What unsettled her most was the new silence of the administration. Where once there had been cautious curiosity about her methods, there was now deliberate distance. Headmaster Whitfield rarely looked her in the eye during meetings. Senior teachers barely acknowledged her presence. The message was clear: she was on her own. And yet Maya's resolve had not broken. If anything, the isolation pushed her deeper into the fire of her purpose. She reminded herself daily that she had not come here to seek validation from those who doubted her. She had come for the children, for the possibility of planting seeds of awareness in soil that had long been tilled only for privilege. It was during one of these heavy days that she arrived to class with a lesson designed to push her students even further. On the board she wrote in crisp chalk letters, "Who gets to decide what intelligence looks like?" The question hung there like a challenge. The students trickled in, their chatter dying as their eyes landed on the words. Ethan smirked, Chloe frowned, and others tilted their heads in confusion. When the bell rang, Maya turned to them with steady eyes. "Today," she said, "we're going to explore this question. I want you to think not just about tests or grades, but about history, culture, and society. Who has the power to say, this is smart, and that is not?" For a moment, silence reigned. Then Ethan scoffed. "Isn't that obvious? People who study harder, who get better grades. That's intelligence." "Interesting," Maya said. "But who writes the tests you study for? Who decides what counts as knowledge?" The question unsettled him. He opened his mouth, then shut it again. Chloe jumped in instead. "Well, experts. Universities. People who know better." Maya nodded. "And historically, who were those people? Who got access to education, to resources, to authority?" The room grew tense. A few students shifted in their seats. One boy muttered, "Not people like you." The words cut like a blade, but Maya didn't flinch. She looked directly at him and said calmly, "Exactly. Not people like me. Not people like many of your ancestors either. That's why we must question. Because if intelligence has only ever been defined by a small group, is it really truth or tradition?" The room was thick with silence. For the first time, Chloe did not roll her eyes. Ethan stared down at his desk, frowning. That afternoon, however, her boldness came back to haunt her. An email arrived from a parent, venomous in its tone. "How dare you fill our children's heads with this nonsense? Intelligence is not a political debate. It is measurable, quantifiable, and Dr. Johnson should stick to teaching facts rather than poisoning impressionable minds." Another email followed. And another. Soon her inbox swelled with complaints, all echoing the same theme: she was overstepping, corrupting, endangering the purity of Westbridge education. Maya read each one, her stomach tightening. She wanted to scream, to slam the laptop shut, to hurl the venom back at them. But instead, she sat quietly, absorbing the weight. She reminded herself of her grandmother's words: "When the world spits at you, stand taller. Their venom is proof of your power." The following morning, the teacher's lounge buzzed with talk of her lesson. She could feel their eyes on her, measuring, judging, whispering. Mrs. Barrett's voice carried across the room, sharp and deliberate. "Some people come in thinking they can change Westbridge overnight. But Westbridge has stood for generations. It will not bend for fads." Maya pretended not to hear, though the words gnawed at her insides. She poured her coffee, her hands steady, her back straight. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. In the classroom, however, something remarkable was happening. The very lesson that had provoked outrage also sparked curiosity. A quiet girl named Hannah raised her hand during discussion and said softly, "I think intelligence can't just be about tests. My brother is dyslexic, but he builds things I could never imagine. Isn't that intelligence too?" The class shifted. Some students nodded reluctantly. Even Chloe seemed momentarily thoughtful. Maya seized the moment. "Yes, Hannah. Intelligence takes many forms. Creativity, resilience, empathy, these are strengths too. Never let anyone convince you they are less." For the first time since she'd begun teaching at Westbridge, Maya felt a shift, subtle but real. The wall of resistance had cracks in it. Small, fragile cracks through which light began to seep. Yet with progress came sabotage. That Friday, she arrived to find her carefully prepared materials missing. The lesson plans she had printed were gone, her chalk snapped in half, her desk drawer ransacked. The students feigned innocence, but their smirks told another story. Maya's heart pounded. It was one thing to face verbal resistance, but now they were undermining her physically. She stood before the class, breathing deeply, her anger rising. Then she steadied herself. "We will not be stopped by missing papers," she declared. She turned to the board and began teaching from memory, her voice firm, her presence unshaken. For every smirk, she delivered truth. For every whisper, she offered wisdom. By the end of class, the smirks had faded. But the battle left her drained. That night, alone in her apartment, she sat in silence, staring at the flicker of the city outside her window. The fatigue seeped into her bones. She thought about quitting, about packing up and leaving the fortress of Westbridge behind. Then she remembered the faces of Hannah, of the boy who discovered the Little Rock Nine, of the girl who had stayed behind after class to confess her shock at segregation. She remembered their hesitant questions, their growing curiosity. She remembered that seeds planted in hostile soil take the longest to sprout, but when they do, they are the strongest. She whispered to herself, "I will not let them win." The next morning, she rose early, ironed her blazer, and braided her hair with care. She walked into Westbridge with her head high. The whispers of parents, the smirks of colleagues, the glares of students, they were noise, nothing more. The truth was louder. In her classroom, she began with a story. "When I was your age," she told them, "my grandmother used to remind me that strength isn't about how loud you shout or how many times you win. Strength is about standing when the world wants you to fall. It's about planting roots so deep that no storm can pull you out." Her voice trembled slightly, but she pressed on. "That's what we are doing here. Together. Planting roots." The students sat in silence, their eyes fixed on her. For a fleeting moment, the weight of the battle lifted. But deep down, Maya knew the hardest fight still lay ahead. The following week began with a strange quiet, the kind that pressed against Maya's ears and made every sound feel heavier. The students filed into the classroom, their faces guarded. The sabotage from the week before lingered in her memory, but she would not allow fear to dictate her steps. That day, she decided to shift gears. She pulled out a stack of blank journals, setting one on each desk. "From today onward," she said, her voice calm but unwavering, "you will keep a learning journal. This is not for grades. It is for reflection. Each day, you will write about what you've learned, what challenged you, or what made you think differently." Groans rippled through the room. Ethan muttered, "More busy work," while Chloe complained under her breath. But Maya ignored the protests. She knew that reflection was a quiet rebellion against indifference. She wanted them to see their own growth, even if they fought it. For the first few days, entries were shallow. Doodles, jokes, one-word responses. But then something shifted. Hannah wrote about her brother's struggles and how it made her see resilience differently. Another boy wrote about his father's business trips and how he realized not everyone had those opportunities. A girl wrote about seeing a homeless man on the way to school and wondering what his life had been like before. Maya read these entries in the evenings, her heart swelling. Beneath the sarcasm and the privilege, these children were thinking. Seeds were taking root. Still, resistance persisted. Some students turned in empty journals. Others mocked those who took it seriously. But Maya had learned to see victories in fragments, to hold on to every glimmer of awareness. One morning, as the students settled in, Chloe raised her hand. Her tone was sharp, rehearsed. "My mother says you're teaching us things that don't matter. She says you're making us feel guilty for things we didn't do." The class froze. All eyes shifted to Maya. Her pulse quickened, but she met Chloe's gaze steadily. "Your mother is right about one thing," she said softly. "You didn't create the world you inherited. None of you did. But you are living in it. And you have the power to decide whether you repeat its mistakes, or build something better." The words hung heavy in the air. For once, Chloe had no immediate retort. Ethan slouched back in his chair, frowning. The silence that followed was not empty but alive, charged with unspoken thought. Later that afternoon, Maya was summoned again to Headmaster Whitfield's office. His expression was stern, his words clipped. "Dr. Johnson, parents are growing increasingly concerned. They feel your lessons are divisive, that you are pushing an agenda rather than teaching the curriculum." Maya held her ground. "With respect, sir, education without context is incomplete. I am not pushing an agenda. I am preparing students to think critically, to understand the world beyond these walls." Whitfield leaned back, his fingers steepled. Be careful, Dr. Johnson. Westbridge values tradition. Step too far outside of it, and you risk your position here. The threat was clear. But as Maya walked out of his office, she felt no fear. Instead, she felt a strange calm. She knew she was not here to preserve Westbridge's traditions. She was here to challenge them. That night, she opened her grandmother's old Bible, the one filled with handwritten notes in the margins. One line caught her eye. Do not grow weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. She closed her eyes, whispering the words like a prayer. The days grew colder, the nights longer. But inside Maya's classroom, a quiet revolution brewed. The journals filled with deeper reflections. Discussions grew sharper, more thoughtful. Students began to challenge each other, not just with arrogance but with curiosity. One day, during a debate, Hannah spoke firmly to Ethan. You say people just need to work harder, but what about those who don't have the same opportunities? Isn't it unfair to judge them by the same standards? Ethan faltered, caught off guard. The class buzzed with murmurs. Maya watched silently, her heart swelling with pride. This was the change she had been fighting for, not instant transformation, but cracks in the wall of ignorance. Of course, progress came with backlash. Parents continued to complain. Teachers whispered. Whitfield's warnings grew sharper. But Maya stood firm. She had discovered a truth: resistance was proof of impact. If she were not making waves, they would not be trying so hard to drown her. The first major exam loomed ahead, casting a shadow over the school. Rumors swirled that Maya's class would fail, that her unorthodox methods would be exposed. Other teachers whispered about betting pools, smugly predicting disaster. Maya felt the pressure, but she refused to let fear seep into her classroom. Instead, she leaned harder into her methods. She created study groups, encouraged peer teaching, and reminded her students that learning was not about rote memorization but about connection, understanding, and critical thought. On the night before the exam, she sat at her desk long after sunset, preparing notes of encouragement for each student. She wrote their names carefully, adding a line of belief for each one. I see your strength. You are capable of more than you know. Your voice matters. The next morning, she handed the notes out quietly, one by one. Some students looked puzzled. Others smiled faintly. Hannah's eyes glistened as she read hers. Even Ethan paused, frowning at the words on his slip before tucking it into his pocket. The exam was grueling. Hours of testing, silence heavy in the air, pencils scratching nervously. Maya paced the aisles, her presence steady, a silent anchor. When it was over, the students filed out, weary and uncertain. Maya gathered the papers, her hands trembling slightly. She knew the results would determine not just her students' futures, but her own. That night, as she graded, she felt her chest tighten. Every correct answer filled her with relief. Every mistake gnawed at her nerves. But as the pile dwindled, a realization dawned. Her students had not only met expectations, they had exceeded them. Their scores were higher than projected. Many had outperformed students in other classes. The data was undeniable. Maya sat back, tears welling in her eyes. The battle was far from over, but this was a victory. A hard-fought, undeniable victory. The next day, she returned the results. The students buzzed with surprise and pride. Hannah beamed. Even Ethan, though trying to hide it, couldn't suppress a small smile. Chloe looked stunned, her confidence shaken. Maya stood before them, her voice steady but filled with quiet emotion. You see? You are capable of more than you imagined. Never let anyone tell you otherwise. As the bell rang and the students filed out, Maya lingered alone in the classroom. The sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the desks. For the first time, she allowed herself to breathe deeply, to feel the weight lifting, if only for a moment. She whispered into the stillness, almost as though speaking to an unseen audience. If this story moves you, if you believe in the fight for voices that too often go unheard, subscribe, share, stand with us. Because change begins when we refuse to be silent. The words echoed softly, a bridge between her struggle and the world beyond. And so, Act I closed not with finality, but with the promise of more battles, more victories, and more resilience. For Maya knew the war within Westbridge was far from over. Winter settled firmly over Westbridge Academy, its ancient stone walls wrapped in frost, its manicured lawns hardened under ice. The prestigious school looked as though time itself had frozen, a monument to tradition, a fortress of privilege. Within those walls, Dr. Maya Johnson carried herself with quiet strength, though her spirit bore the bruises of countless small battles. Act I had been an introduction to her place in this alien world, a world where parents' whispers followed her like shadows, colleagues measured her with cool, condescending glances, and students tested the limits of her patience. But now, as the seasons turned, the true battle was beginning. By January, the hum of the coming mid-year examinations filled every corridor. At Westbridge, the exams were not just routine evaluations, they were rituals of status, tools used by parents and administrators alike to measure not only the children's potential but the competence of the teachers who molded them. For Maya, this was more than an exam. It was a verdict on her presence in the school. Every parent who doubted her, every teacher who sneered at her progressive methods, every administrator who wished her gone, they were waiting for one thing: her failure. She felt it in the way Mr. Grayson, the math teacher, smirked as she passed him in the lounge. "Big test coming," he said once, sipping his coffee with deliberate nonchalance. "Hope your creativity doesn't confuse the kids." His words stung, but she met them with silence. She had learned early on that replying only fed their smugness. But the pressure was not only external. It seeped into the classroom, pressing down on her students. They slouched in their seats, sighed at assignments, whispered to each other when they thought she wasn't listening. The tension clung to them like damp coats. Some students resisted openly. Chloe, one of the most outspoken, complained loudly during a review session. "Why do we have to do it this way? None of the other teachers make us. You're just trying to make everything harder." Maya held her gaze firmly. "I am trying to make you stronger," she said, her voice low but unyielding. "Tests are not about regurgitating facts. They are about thinking clearly under pressure. And you will think clearly. All of you." Some students rolled their eyes. But others, Hannah especially, straightened in their seats, as though sensing that Maya's determination was something to borrow strength from. After class, Hannah lingered. "Dr. Johnson," she said softly, "my dad says it doesn't matter what we do in here, because they're going to fire you anyway." The words twisted like a knife. Maya crouched slightly to meet her eye level. "Do you believe that?" Hannah shook her head firmly. "No. I think you're the best teacher I've had." Maya's throat ached, but she forced a smile. "Then let's prove him wrong together." In that moment, a line was drawn. The classroom stopped being just a space of learning. It became a battlefield of conviction. She prepared with an intensity that consumed her evenings and weekends. Piles of practice exams spread across her dining table. Lesson plans sprawled in notebooks. She refined strategies that blended rigor with creativity, drills balanced with discussions, review sheets paired with reflective exercises, even meditative breathing to calm nerves before timed practice. She knew they needed more than knowledge, they needed resilience. But even as she built her students up, unseen hands sought to pull her down. On a cold Monday morning, she discovered the stack of review booklets she had printed had gone missing. She scoured the supply closet, checked her classroom twice. Finally, she found them crumpled in a trash bin near the copier, smeared with spilled coffee. Sabotage, plain and deliberate. When she asked around, her colleagues feigned ignorance. Mr. Grayson shrugged. Ms. Clark, the literature teacher, said sweetly, "Oh dear, maybe you misplaced them?" New environment can be so overwhelming. The malice hidden behind smiles was suffocating. Yet Maya refused to let her students suffer for others' cruelty. She stayed late, reprinting every booklet, binding them by hand long after the halls had emptied. She walked out at midnight, exhausted but unwilling to yield. "You can take my papers," she whispered to herself as she locked the classroom. "But you cannot take their minds." Her efforts began to bear fruit. Slowly, scores on practice tests climbed. Students who once slumped in defeat now straightened with cautious pride. Even Ethan, once her most stubborn skeptic, began asking questions after class, his voice hesitant but earnest. "Dr. Johnson, I think I actually get this now." Her heart swelled each time she saw such small victories. They were not just learning material, they were learning faith in themselves. But the outside world pressed harder. Letters from parents arrived, thinly veiled accusations couched in concern. "Our children are being distracted from the fundamentals. Is this truly preparing them for the rigor of Westbridge?" One even said outright, "Perhaps Dr. Johnson's approach is better suited for other schools, but not ours." The headmaster summoned her again, his office dim and oppressive. Whitfield leaned back in his leather chair, fingers steepled. "Dr. Johnson, I'll be frank. There is discontent. Many parents feel your methods are unorthodox. They fear your students may not perform." Maya sat upright, her eyes burning but her tone calm. "With respect, sir, performance will not be the issue. My students are learning not just to pass exams, but to understand. Isn't that the goal of education?" Whitfield's mouth twisted. "The goal, Dr. Johnson, is results. Parents pay for excellence, not experiments." Her hands tightened on her lap. She wanted to shout, to demand why her passion was labeled an experiment, while her colleagues' monotony was praised as tradition. But she held her tongue, knowing any misstep would be twisted against her. As February approached, the exam drew nearer, and Maya's classroom grew tense with preparation. Students groaned under the weight of practice drills, but they came alive during her creative approaches. When she read aloud Langston Hughes' "I too," her voice steady and rich, silence fell heavy on the room. By the final line, "I too am America," even Ethan looked moved, his gaze fixed on the page. Afterward, Maya asked, "What does it mean to claim I am America when the world tells you you are not?" The question lingered. For some, it was uncomfortable. For others, it was liberating. She saw it in Hannah's eyes, in the way Chloe hesitated before scoffing. Seeds were being planted, seeds of thought, of challenge, of empathy. And yet, in the hallways, Chloe's voice still rang with mockery. "I too am America." She jeered with her friends, mimicking Maya's cadence. Their laughter stung, but Maya walked past with head high. She had learned that dignity was its own form of defiance. On the eve of the exam, Maya sat in her small apartment surrounded by flickering candles, her table buried beneath lesson plans and journals. She opened one of the journals at random, flipping to Hannah's neat handwriting. "I used to think history was boring. Now I see it's alive, and it matters to me." She turned another page, Ethan's reluctant scrawl. "I didn't care at first. But now I realize how different life is for people outside my world. I guess I never thought about it before." Her eyes blurred with tears. These were not just exam scores. These were awakenings. Proof that the battle was already being won. She closed the journal and whispered into the quiet. "Stand with me tomorrow. All of you. Every ancestor, every teacher, every child who was told they did not belong. Stand with me." The morning of the exams arrived draped in silence, as though the school itself understood the gravity of what was at stake. The sky hung low and gray, the air sharp enough to bite. Parents lingered in the parking lot longer than usual, their eyes sharp with expectation, their voices low with speculation. Inside, the students shuffled nervously through the corridors, clutching pencils, fidgeting with papers, their chatter brittle with anxiety. Maya stood at the doorway of her classroom, greeting each child as they entered. Her smile was steady, though her pulse thundered. She touched Hannah's shoulder lightly. "You are ready," she said. She gave Ethan a nod. "Trust yourself." To each one, she offered a small affirmation, words meant to shield them against the storm waiting in the silence of the exam. As the papers were distributed, a hush fell. Pages turned, pencils scratched. Maya walked slowly between the rows, her presence a quiet anchor. She saw the furrow of brows, the tapping of feet, the tightness in shoulders. But she also saw something else: determination. They were not the same children who had slouched in disbelief months ago. They leaned into the challenge now, as though daring the test to underestimate them. Hours stretched. The sound of graphite on paper, the faint coughs, the shifting of chairs created a rhythm both tense and strangely sacred. At moments, Maya closed her eyes, breathing deeply, offering silent prayers. Let them remember, let them believe, let them know they are more than what others say. When the final bell rang, the release was almost physical. Students exhaled audibly, some with shaky laughter, some collapsing forward on their desks. Hannah looked up at her teacher, cheeks flushed. "That wasn't as bad as I thought," she whispered. Ethan gave a crooked smile. "I think I actually nailed it." Maya gathered the papers with steady hands, though her heart raced. She knew the true exam lay not on those desks but in the corridors beyond, in the eyes of colleagues, in the judgment of parents, in the calculations of Whitfield. The following days were heavy with waiting. Parents hovered at dismissal, fishing for hints of results. Colleagues spoke in tones too loud to be accidental. "Some people bite off more than they can chew," Mr. Grayson muttered in the lounge. Ms. Clark replied with a sweet laugh. "Yes, well, innovation is risky. Not everyone survives it." Maya bore it silently, her strength drawn from the memory of her students bent over their papers, unflinching. She remembered Hannah's whispered courage, Ethan's quiet pride. Whatever the results, she knew seeds had been planted. When the envelope finally arrived, she carried it to her classroom before opening it. The students were already buzzing with rumors, anticipation crackling in the air. Maya held the envelope aloft. "These results," she said, her voice firm, "are not just numbers. They are proof of your effort, your persistence, your courage." With deliberate hands, she tore it open. Her eyes scanned the sheet, and her breath caught. Then she smiled, wide, unrestrained, radiant. "You did it," she whispered. "You all did it." Gasps echoed around the room. Then laughter, cheers, clapping hands. Hannah leapt from her seat, hugging Ethan, who laughed in shock. "We beat them?" he asked, incredulous. "You didn't just pass," Maya said, her voice breaking. "You outperformed nearly every other class in the school." For a heartbeat, silence fell, the stunned silence of disbelief. Then the classroom erupted. Chairs scraped, voices shouted, tears sprang to eyes. Children who had doubted themselves, who had carried their parents' scorn like chains, now shouted their triumph to the ceiling. Maya stood among them, tears streaming down her cheeks. She thought of her grandmother, her mother, every teacher who had carried her, every ancestor who had walked through fire so she could stand here. Their voices seemed to echo in her chest. "We are with you. You are not alone." News spread like wildfire. In the halls, students whispered with awe. Some parents, previously the loudest critics, now stared at their children in stunned pride. Teachers exchanged tight-lipped glances, their smugness dissolving into reluctant respect. Whitfield summoned her once more. His office, lined with books and awards, felt colder than ever. He cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. "Dr. Johnson, it seems your students have exceeded expectations." Maya met his gaze without flinching. "They worked hard. They believed in themselves. That's what education should do." Whitfield hesitated, his jaw tightening. "It appears your methods have merit after all." The words were dragged out, unwilling, but they were an admission nonetheless. When Maya left his office, the corridors felt different. The walls, once heavy with hostility, seemed lighter. Students smiled at her, some shyly, others with unrestrained joy. Even Chloe, who had been her harshest student critic, approached hesitantly. I guess I was wrong," she muttered. Maya simply smiled and said, "I'm glad you've learned more than just what was on the test." That evening, she gathered her class for a quiet moment. They sat in a circle, the winter sun setting beyond the windows. Do you understand what you've accomplished? Maya asked, her voice trembling. They said we would fail. They said we couldn't. But you proved them wrong, not just for me, but for yourselves. This is your victory. The children nodded, their faces glowing with pride. Hannah whispered, We couldn't have done it without you. Maya shook her head gently. You already had it within you. I just reminded you. As they packed their bags and left, she lingered in the empty room, the echo of their laughter still warm in the air. She placed a hand on the desk, whispering, This is only the beginning. The battle of the classroom had not ended prejudice, nor erased the scorn of those determined to diminish her. But it had carved a crack in the fortress of Westbridge. Through that crack, light poured, the light of possibility, the light of resilience, the light of children discovering their own strength. Maya knew more storms would come. But for the first time, she felt unshakable. She had stood in the fire and remained whole. And her students had walked through with her. Spring thawed the frost of Westbridge Academy, and with it came an uneasy quiet. The shock of Maya's students' success lingered in the air like a stubborn perfume, undeniable yet uncomfortable for those who had wagered on her downfall. Where once there had been whispers of failure, now there was silence, brittle, strained, edged with reluctant respect. In the teacher's lounge, conversations shifted awkwardly when she entered. Mr. Grayson, who had mocked her creativity, no longer smirked, though his silence carried its own bitterness. Ms. Clark offered her lukewarm smiles, syrupy in tone but hollow in heart. Only a few, like the kindly music instructor Mr. Patel, dared to speak openly. They did brilliantly, Maya, he said one afternoon, patting her shoulder. That's something no one can take away from you, or from them. But while some battles had been won, the war was not yet over. The final examinations in June loomed like mountains on the horizon, casting long shadows over every lesson, every interaction. At Westbridge, the end-of-year scores were the crown jewel of prestige. They were paraded in glossy brochures, flaunted at alumni events, whispered in dinner parties. And though Maya's mid-year victory had silenced some critics, others sharpened their knives anew. Parents spoke more carefully now, but their skepticism had not vanished. During pickup one afternoon, a father in a tailored suit stopped her. His tone was measured, polite, but the bite lay underneath. Dr. Johnson, I admit the midterms surprised us all. But one swallow does not make a summer. Let's hope the final exams are as illuminating. His thin smile carried the weight of a challenge, as though daring her to stumble. Maya met his gaze steady as stone. I don't hope, she replied. I prepare. Inside the classroom, the energy was different now. Her students, once dismissive, now looked at her with pride, with a growing trust. They remembered what it felt like to win, to stand taller than others expected. Yet with that pride came pressure. They feared letting her down, feared their parents' judgment even more. The weight of expectation pressed heavily on their young shoulders. Maya felt it too. She had lifted them once, but could she do it again? Success, she realized, was a double-edged sword. It silenced doubt, but it also raised the stakes. And so, she dug deeper. Lessons became richer, weaving history with present struggles, mathematics with logic and justice, literature with empathy. She asked questions that made them pause. When history forgets voices, who loses? If knowledge is power, who is afraid of you having it? At first, they stumbled through answers. But slowly, they grew bolder, willing to wrestle with the questions, to see knowledge not as a burden but as a weapon of dignity. One rainy afternoon, she handed out essays on Frederick Douglass, asking each student to reflect on the meaning of freedom in their own lives. Hannah wrote, Freedom is knowing my teacher believes in me, even when others don't. Ethan, who once scoffed at her methods, surprised her with his honesty. Freedom is not caring if people think I can't, because now I know I can. Their words became her shield against every sneer, every memo from Whitfield questioning her methods. Still, the headmaster persisted. At a faculty meeting in May, he addressed the staff with thinly veiled barbs. As we approach finals, it's important that we adhere to the standards and traditions that make Westbridge exemplary. Novelty has its place, but parents pay for reliability. His eyes flicked briefly toward Maya. She sat quietly, her hands clasped, refusing to be baited. She had learned long ago that resilience was sometimes silence, and sometimes it was letting results speak louder than words. The weeks blurred into a rhythm of work and preparation. Students stayed after class willingly now, gathering around her desk with questions, discussions spilling into debates that lasted long past the bell. The classroom became a sanctuary, alive with voices, filled with a sense of shared mission. And yet, shadows still lingered. Chloe, though softened, continued to test boundaries, her sarcasm sharper than most. One afternoon she muttered under her breath, "It's not like one teacher changes the whole school." Maya paused, then spoke with quiet firmness. "No, Chloe. But one teacher can change one classroom. And one classroom can ripple outward farther than you realize." The words hung in the air, not just for Chloe but for everyone. As finals approached, parents grew restless. Meetings grew tense, emails flooded inboxes. Some praised the transformation in their children, begrudgingly admitting they saw more confidence, more curiosity. Others accused Maya of overstepping her role, of indoctrination disguised as education. One letter reached her desk, unsigned but venomous. "You don't belong here. No matter what your students score, you'll never be one of us." Maya read it once, twice. Then she folded it carefully, placed it in her desk, and whispered, "I am not here to belong. I am here to teach." The day of the finals dawned bright, the spring sun spilling across the manicured lawns. The atmosphere was electric, charged with nerves and anticipation. Students filed into classrooms, eyes wide, clutching sharpened pencils as though they were weapons. Maya stood before her class, her heart steady, her voice calm. "Remember," she said softly, "this is not just about answers. This is about showing yourselves what you can do. Whatever happens, you have already proven more than they could imagine." The exam began. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rustle of pages and the scratching of pencils. Time dragged, heavy and merciless. Maya watched, her presence a silent pillar. She thought of her grandmother's words, of the countless teachers before her who had stood in classrooms with nothing but determination and love. When the hours ended, students staggered out, drained but relieved. Hannah rushed to her. "I think we did it," she whispered breathlessly. Ethan grinned. "I actually finished early. That's never happened." Maya smiled, though her own nerves remained unrelieved. "I'm proud of you already," she said. Now came the waiting. The results arrived weeks later, in a sealed envelope thicker than the first. Maya carried it again to her classroom. Her students gathered around, their faces alight with hope and fear. She opened it slowly, each second stretching like an eternity. And then, relief, joy, triumph. "Outstanding," the report read. Her class had not only passed, they had soared. Their scores ranked at the very top, surpassing even the school's most distinguished instructors. The room erupted in cheers, students hugging, laughing, some even crying. Hannah threw her arms around Maya, whispering, "We proved them wrong again." Ethan laughed until tears streaked his cheeks. Chloe, quieter than the rest, approached at last. "You were right," she murmured. "One teacher can change a lot." Maya's eyes filled, her voice thick. "No, Chloe. We did this together." As the children celebrated, Maya looked out the window at the sprawling lawns of Westbridge. For the first time since she arrived, they did not feel foreign. They felt claimed. Not by the institution, but by the work, by the children who had chosen to rise with her. She whispered to herself, almost like a prayer, "This is what they can never take away." Summer settled over Westbridge Academy like a slow exhale, golden light spilling across the lawns, shadows stretching long and soft. The year had ended, but the echoes of it lingered everywhere. Students who had once slouched in Maya's classroom now walked taller in the hallways. Their laughter carried a sharper joy, their eyes a brighter confidence. They had tasted victory not just on paper but in the marrow of their bones. For Maya, the shift was both subtle and seismic. She still felt the coolness in certain glances, still heard the brittle edge in whispered conversations. But something fundamental had changed. She was no longer seen as an intruder waiting to fail. She was now the teacher who had shattered the ceiling of expectation. Her very presence had become a question the school could not ignore. What if she is exactly what Westbridge needs? The Board of Trustees invited her to the end-of-year banquet, a tradition where achievements were paraded and the school's prestige polished to perfection. The dining hall glittered with chandeliers, tables draped in ivory cloth, silverware gleaming like medals of war. Parents in elegant attire sipped wine, exchanging pleasantries laced with unspoken rivalries. Maya sat at the edge of the room, her dress modest, her back straight, her heart steady. When her class's results were announced, the applause was hesitant at first, then fuller, carried by those who could not deny the brilliance of the numbers. Some clapped reluctantly, others with genuine admiration. A few avoided her gaze entirely. Whitfield rose, his voice smooth as silk, heavy with performance. This year, one class has set a remarkable precedent. Under the guidance of Dr. Maya Johnson, our students achieved scores that exceeded even the highest expectations. He paused, the words clearly difficult to swallow. It is a testament to her dedication. Polite applause followed. Maya felt no triumph in his strained acknowledgement, only a quiet vindication. For she knew the truth, it was not just her victory, but her students, carved from sweat and struggle, from nights of doubt turned into mornings of courage. Later, as she walked home under the velvet sky, she thought of the journey. The cold welcomes, the sabotages, the ridicule. The laughter behind her back, the whispered predictions of failure. And she thought of the faces of her students, Hannah's fierce determination, Ethan's newfound confidence, Chloe's softened skepticism. Against the weight of a system, they had risen. In the weeks that followed, letters arrived. Some from parents who admitted they had misjudged her. Some from colleagues offering cautious congratulations. But the letters that mattered most were from her students. One read, "Dr. Johnson, you didn't just teach us math and history. You taught us how to believe in ourselves when no one else did." Another said, "You showed me I can do hard things. I want to be a teacher one day, like you." She kept those letters tucked in her desk drawer, treasures more valuable than any accolade the school could bestow. Yet Maya knew the story did not end here. Racism did not vanish with a single victory. Doubt did not dissolve in the face of test scores. The battle for equity in education was larger than Westbridge, larger than her classroom. It stretched back generations, and forward into a future still uncertain. But she also knew this: every victory mattered. Every child who stood taller was a crack in the walls of prejudice. Every classroom that turned into a sanctuary of dignity was a spark against the darkness. On the final day of summer, she returned to her empty classroom. The desks were neatly arranged, sunlight spilling across them like benediction. She walked slowly between the rows, hearing faint echoes of laughter, of whispered courage, of pencils scratching hope into paper. At the front of the room, she placed her hand on the board, breathing deeply. "This is where battles are fought," she whispered. "And this is where we win." The camera of imagination pulls back now, the image widening beyond the classroom, beyond Westbridge Academy, beyond even Maya herself. It sweeps across neighborhoods where black children sit in classrooms too often doubted, too often dismissed. It hovers over teachers who stand in the fire daily, carrying not just lessons but the weight of history on their shoulders. It settles in the hearts of viewers listening now, reminding them that this story is not just Maya's, not just her students. It is the story of resilience, of courage, of blackness refusing to bow under pressure. The classroom battle is never truly over. But with every Maya, with every child who learns to rise, the tide shifts. The fortress of prejudice cracks. And through the cracks, light continues to pour. So as this chapter closes, let the story remain with you. Remember Dr. Maya Johnson, who walked into a hostile place and turned it into a sanctuary. Remember her students, who proved not only their brilliance but their dignity. And remember that education is not just about facts and scores, it is about liberation, about unlocking the power that prejudice fears most, the power of knowledge. And if you've journeyed with us through this hour of reflection, resilience, and triumph, take a moment to stand with us. Subscribe to Blackness Hour, where stories like these are not just told, they are honored, they are remembered, they are carried forward. Because every voice matters. Every story deserves to be heard. And together, we ensure they never fade into silence. The classroom battle is never truly over. Each generation must face it anew, the struggle against silence, against doubt, against the weight of prejudice dressed as tradition. But every victory matters. Every voice raised, every child who learns to believe in their own power, pushes back against the darkness. Dr. Maya Johnson's story is not just hers. It belongs to every Black teacher who dared to enter hostile spaces, every student who refused to bow to low expectations, every community that carried the flame of knowledge when the world tried to extinguish it. And as we close this hour, remember, education is more than lessons. It is liberation. It is resistance. It is triumph. If her journey moved you, let it not end here. Subscribe to Blackness Hour. Share this story. Add your voice to the chorus that insists these stories must be told, again and again, until silence is no longer possible. Because blackness is not defeat. Blackness is not failure. Blackness is resilience. Blackness is brilliance. Blackness is triumph. And this is Blackness Hour.